Ask that you would turn to Mark, the fourth chapter. Mark chapter 4, and we're going to look at verses 35 through 41. And for some of us in this room, this is very familiar, probably from this week. Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. I'm going to read from the English Standard Version, but when I go through the text, I'll be using the New International Version. Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. Everyone there? And it says, "On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, 'Let us go across to the other side.' And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the sea, and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, 'Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?' And they were filled with great fear, and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" Amen. I want to talk briefly, using as a subject, get ready to go to the other side. Get ready to go to the other side. Often we focus, and when I say we as preachers often focus on the storm itself in this text. We focus on the storm, and we focus on Jesus speaking to the storm and telling the storm, "Peace, be still." But I really want to, as much as possible, focus on where it says where Jesus says in verse 35, "Let us go over to the other side." And I want to focus on that because that's something that we often, I believe, overlook. Because yes, they had to go through the storm. Yes, Jesus spoke to the storm, told the storm, "Peace, be still." But when you look at that simple phrase, when Jesus says, "Let's go to the other side," Jesus was already telling them that it was time, that they were going to the other side. Jesus had already given them their destination, but yet with everything that they were about to encounter, their faith was still at such a place where they had forgotten that Jesus said, "We're going to the other side." And I want to encourage you all, as I encourage myself, to remember that Jesus has already promised that we're going to the other side. And when I say the other side, I don't necessarily have a particular destination, but when I say the other side, I mean Jesus already has promised a destination. He's promised, he's given us a purpose. He's given us an assignment. And as we've heard and as we've learned before, that assignment that we have been given, we can't go anywhere. We won't. I'll just go ahead and say, you can't die until you've finished and completed that assignment. If God has given you a purpose, you're not going anywhere before you fulfill that purpose. So I want to jump right into this. Jesus has spent a whole day teaching and performing miracles. If you look back, just even in chapter 4, Jesus has already taught several parables. He has, I believe he's healed, I can't remember, I believe he had healed a man with a shriveled hand. Jesus has already performed miracle after miracle. He has been teaching all day. And the crowds had grown so large that were following Jesus that he actually, if you look back, I want to say it's in chapter 3, but he actually had to get in the boat in order to be able to speak to the people. The crowds had grown so large that were following Jesus after they had seen the miracles that he performed. So many people began to start following Jesus, and there were so many people that were pushing in on him, wanting to try to get to Jesus, that he actually had to get in the boat and sit in the boat and teach from the boat to the people on the shore. So this is what Jesus has been doing. He's been teaching. He's been healing. He's been doing all kinds of things. And he's finally, the Bible says, Mark tells us that it's evening now. And Jesus is exhausted from doing ministry. He's exhausted. He's tired. He's tired from all of the people that are pushing in on him, that are wanting him to do something for them. And he's so tired that he tells his disciples, come on, it's time to go to the other side so I can get some rest. Verse 35 says, that day when evening came, and this is from the New International Version, that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. Mark, there are 3 accounts of this particular event. They're found, one is in Matthew chapter 8, the other is in Luke, and then of course in Mark. Mark specifically tells us, however, that it's now evening. And this helps us to understand, if you will, 2 things. Number 1, it helps us to understand that Jesus, as I've already said, has been teaching all day. And then 2, this particular Mark telling us that it's evening also sets the scene and builds suspense, if you will, because a storm on the water at night is much more terrifying than a storm during the day. And I just want to pause here, and if you think about that, even if you think about a storm on a boat at night, when you think about the storms that we go through in our lives, when we feel like we have some semblance of being able to see what's going on and understand what's going on, it seems that much easier. But sometimes we go through some particular storms when it seems like it's the dead of night, in the middle of a storm. We have no idea what's going on, no idea which way is up, which way is down. And that's the type of environment that this was. That was the type of physical storm that they were going through. It was beginning to be nighttime. And not only was it the beginning of night, but they were getting ready to go into a violent windstorm. So then Jesus leads them into a storm. It was Jesus's idea, and I think that's important to note, that Jesus is the one that led the disciples into the storm. Don't be, and I say that, it cut off. I say that to remind us not to be so quick to blame our storms on the devil. It may just be that God has led you and I into a particular storm in order to do 2 things. Number 1, to show us his power. But then number 2, to take you to the next level, or the next level being the other side. The other side refers to, and I'm going to get to this again, but the other side refers to the eastern side of Galilee, which was Gentile territory. And, well, I don't want to go there yet. So, the Jesus leads them into the storm, and I believe that he often will lead us into a storm. Again, number one, to show us his power, but then also to take us to the next level. Verse 36, the Bible says, leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. And then it says there were other boats with him. And I got stuck on that phrase, just as he was. And I've been stuck on that phrase ever since I've really paid attention to this text. And ever since I've read this text and tried to preach from it, I got stuck on just as he was. I kept saying, what in the world does that mean? Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. And I think I got an answer. This phrase, just as he was, Jesus, as I already said, was already in the boat. One commentator, he was in a boat that probably was one that he traveled in on a regular basis. It was almost his, today, like you may have your own personal car service. It was the boat that Jesus regularly traveled in. So it was not only was it the boat that he was used to already being in, but it was also the fact that simply he was already in the boat. So taking him along just as he was in the boat means, and I guess I was trying to make it more deep than it actually is, but just as he was, number one, he was already in the boat. He was already in a boat that he was familiar with. But then the disciples did not wait or make any accommodations for the trip across the sea. So they took Jesus just as he was. They didn't go back to shore in order to get Jesus to go plate, in order to take something to eat across the sea. They didn't make sure Jesus was able to change his clothes out of his sweaty shirt, take his robe off and put on a new shirt. And they did not make any special accommodations. So they took him just as he was, exhausted and tired, having taught all day long. Just as he was, they took him across the sea. They didn't make any special preparations for the trip. And I wonder, with my imagination, if this was part of the setup. Because remember, we're talking about Jesus has already said we're going to the other side. Not only are they going to the other side, now we see they didn't make any special accommodations. They didn't make any preparation, and that will hopefully make sense in just a minute. They were professional fishermen. So if they had taken the time to make preparations for the journey, they would have been more prepared for the journey, or more prepared for the storm that would come. And it's important to remember that they are professional fishermen. They should not be caught off guard by a storm, and they should not be caught off guard by a storm in this particular place, because the Sea of Galilee is, this particular location is prone to windstorms. It sits 690 feet below sea level and is surrounded by hills. So it's actually in a valley. To the north is Mount Hermon, which rises 9,200 feet above. And from the months of May to October, strong winds often sweep through the narrow surroundings, or through the narrow surrounding gorges, into this valley, causing extremely sudden and violent storms. So in other words, these professional fishermen, if they had made the proper accommodations and preparations, it may have been that they would have been more prepared for the storm. But I say that it was a setup, that they did not make preparations. Number one, Jesus was tired and just wanted to get out of there. If you've ever been working all day, if you've ever been doing something, even if it's something that you love, at some point you become exhausted physically, emotionally, mentally tired, and you've got to just get out and get some rest. So they took Jesus just as he was. He was already in the boat. He was exhausted. He was tired. They said, come on, let's just go. But unfortunately, they were not prepared as they should have been for this particular storm. The Greek word here can also mean whirlwind. In this case, this particular storm, this particular whirlwind was so severe that it took on the properties of a hurricane. It wasn't just another windstorm, but it was more. If you've ever been in a coastal city, if you've ever been on the beach, if you've ever been on the coast during a hurricane, you know that a hurricane, yes, tornadoes are terrifying, but hurricanes, you cannot see. All you know, the only way you know that there is a hurricane is you see trees blowing, you see rain falling, and you feel the wind blowing, and that's the only way you can you know that there is a hurricane. So in this particular case, this storm was like a hurricane. When the cold air from Mount Hermon meets the rising warm air from the sea, it often then results in a storm. And then on top of that, fishing boats of that day had two low sides in order that they would be able to cast their nets over the sides. So, and since many of the disciples again were fishermen by trade, we can then conclude that they were probably in a fishing boat. But even with all of that being understood, they were professional fishermen, but they were not prepared for this storm. The boats began to easily fill with water, and I want to say to that sometimes God will let you go through an impossible situation not to kill you. He'll allow you to go through a hurricane type storm in your life, not to kill you, but instead to show you how great he is. Your storm then, your storm, my storm, our storms are not about our weakness, but rather they are about God's power. So whenever you find yourself at the deepest, darkest, most violent part of your storm, when you find yourself even in the eye of the hurricane, that is not the time to give up, but instead to start expecting God to show up. So now they're in a boat. They're in the middle of the sea at night, in the middle of a storm, on their way into Gentile territory. And from where they were on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, they were on their way to go to the other side, would take them, of course, to the eastern side of Galilee. And I bring that up because they were on their way into Gentile or non-Jewish territory, which really isn't that important, but it's just important. I just bring that up to kind of give us some context. But not only was it Gentile territory, going over to the other side of the lake was taking them to a place that did not have very large cities. So that meant there would not be large crowds as there were on the western side that they had just left. So Jesus was going because he wanted to get some rest. So it made sense. Well, let's go to the other side. There aren't any large cities. There's not going to be hardly as many people. So I can go. I can get some sleep on the trip, like just like we try to do when we go fly. We take our pillow, our travel pillow. We try to lean back in the seat if we can. And even if it's a short flight, we just try to lean back and just take a nap, because traveling in and of itself, after having worked all day, and then traveling in and of itself can be exhausting. So Jesus is just simply trying to get some rest. Verse 38 says, Jesus was in the storm, sleeping on a cushion. He had his travel pillow wrapped around. He was ready. He was good to go. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" I'm going to park there just for a moment. Jesus was asleep. This was the only time recorded in the Gospels that we find that Jesus was actually asleep. One commentator states that just before the disciples saw one of the most awesome displays of Jesus's deity, they were giving given a touching picture of his humanity. So in other words, they were about to see Jesus in all of his glory and all of his power. They were about to see him speak to the very elements of nature. But just before they saw Jesus do this, they saw Jesus at one of his most human points. They see him tired, weary, and exhausted. He was so tired that the tossing storm, the waves, the wind and the waves tossing the boat the way they did, Jesus was so tired that not even the storm woke him up. This lets me know then that I need to not to get discouraged when I feel like I'm at my weakest point, because it could be that in my weakness, God is preparing me for something I've never seen before. Jesus was tired and was weary. It would seem like he was at his weakest point. It would seem like Jesus, from a natural standpoint, was not going to be able to perform a miracle of this magnitude. But Jesus, being who he was, even though he was tired and sleeping, when the disciples came to him, and let me not get ahead of myself, then he was exhausted, as I said, from teaching all day. Ministry then requires rest. Regardless of what kind of ministry you're in, it requires rest. Jesus was asleep because he had been ministering to the multitude. What's important to understand is that Jesus entrusted himself to God the Father. He could rest because he was confident in who he was and in his power. Jesus teaches us a valuable lesson then, that we can rest and don't have to be overwhelmed by the storms of life, because our lives, just like Jesus, our lives are in God's hands. And when God has called you to do something, you don't have to worry about when or how it's going to get done. You can just rest in who God is and who God has called you to be, because you know he's taking you to the other side. Verse 39, he got up, the Bible says, rebuked the wind and said to the waves, quiet, be still, or peace, be still. Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. Just like that, the storm was over. That which was a great storm was now a great calm. That which is raging in our lives, that which is causing us the most stress, if we give it to God and allow God to handle it, that which becomes the most stressful to us can become a place of calm. That's when we know that our faith is being strengthened and being matured, when we're able to sleep and have peace even when the storm is raging around us. So I just want to look at that phrase, peace, be still, really quickly. Peace means an involuntary, and this is important, involuntary stillness or inability to speak. Your storm then wants to take you out, but it can't. An involuntary stillness, meaning that the storm has no choice but to do what Jesus says. The winds had no choice but to stop. When Jesus said peace, the winds could not continue to blow. It was involuntary. They wanted to continue to blow. Things in our lives, Satan wants things to continue to go wrong, but when Jesus speaks peace, they have no choice but to stop. Your storm wants to kill you. Your storm wants to take you out, but when Jesus speaks peace, he says peace, then he says be still. To be still means to muzzle. Like when you put a muzzle on a dog, it means to prevent from speaking, to prevent a dog from barking or making too much noise. A muzzle is used to control. So the phrase is in what is called in Greek language the perfect tense. With the use of perfect tense, it means be still and stay still. So when Jesus tells the wind and the waves, peace, be still, he's telling the wind and the waves, be quiet, be still, and you have to stay still. Don't try to start up again. When I go back to sleep, don't try to sneak up on me again. Jesus is saying, no, be still now and stay still. You cannot come back. You cannot start up again. So when Jesus speaks to your storm, he speaks permanently. He speaks in a perfect tense. When he speaks peace to your storm, he's speaking, telling your storm, not only be still now, but stay still, and you can't come back to try to start all over again. So nature immediately responded to Jesus's voice. When Jesus finally speaks to your storm, there will be no room for question, no room for negotiation. Your storm then will have to cease. Mm-hmm. Remember that Jesus was tired and wanted to get some rest, so this is why that they left the crowd on the western side to go to the eastern side. However, and I'm almost finished, however, if you go to chapter 5 and read verses 1 and 2. Remember, Jesus was leaving the crowd just to try to get some rest. But if you go to chapter 5, as soon as Jesus steps off of the boat. Now, mind you, and I want to make sure to remind us that the reason he left in the first place was because he was exhausted and weary and tired from doing ministry. But as soon as he steps foot off of the boat, he is met by a man possessed with a demon. It would appear then that power nap that Jesus got on the boat was all he was going to get. He didn't have time to go find a hotel. He didn't have time to go find a Holiday Inn, check in, get some rest. As soon as he stepped off the boat, a man possessed by a demon met him there. When Jesus tells you it's time to go to the other side, he is not calling you to be lazy, but instead he's preparing you for your next assignment. So my word of advice then would be to get some rest when you can, because the work has to continue. Jesus preached, healed, healed, and even calmed a stormy sea. But as soon as he got to the other side, somebody was waiting for him. And I say to us that there's someone is waiting for you to come out of your storm so they can use you. Someone is waiting for you to come out of your storm because they think when you come out of your storm, they'll be able to take advantage of you because you'll be tired, because you'll be weak, because you'll be weary, because you'll be exhausted from everything that you went through on your way to the other side. They think that when you get there, and this is just me using my imagination, but they think that when you get there to the other side out of your storm, you won't have any power to say no. So they think they can take advantage of you. But Jesus is using the storm that you're going through to prepare you for the other side. They think you're coming out tired and weak, but it's just the opposite. God is going to show himself mightily in your storm so that when you come out, you'll trust him even more and be able to do even greater things and greater works for him. So just 3 quick points and I'll be finished. As we talk about this idea of going to the other side, get ready to go to the other side. Get ready to go. If I was T.D. Jakes, I would try to say, get ready, get ready, get ready. I'm saying to us, get ready to go to the other side. And in order, when you prepare to go to the other side, when it is that time, number one, you've got to be obviously prepared for a storm. Get ready to go to the other side, but before you get to the other side, you've got to realize that there are going to be some stormy seas in between. You're going to be trying to get from your western side to your eastern side, but all in between, there are going to be some storms to arise. There are going to be some financial storms. There are going to be some storms in your family. There are going to be some storms in your mind. There are going to be some storms in your life, in your heart, in your body. There are going to be whatever, however that storm may affect you or may play itself out. There are going to be storms. So when you get ready to go to the other side, yes, be excited about going to the other side, but be prepared to hit a storm. According to Matthew, not just any old storms, but storms like you've never seen. And according to Matthew, he calls it a great squall. He says a great squall arose. This, as I said, was like a hurricane. These were hurricane force winds. So I encourage us tonight, and I'm asking and I'm admonishing, if you will, us, when Jesus says get ready to go to the other side, be prepared for a storm, but not just for any old storm, any old run-of-the-mill thunderstorm. Be prepared for a hurricane to come at you, but not only be prepared for the hurricane, know that even when the hurricane is raging around you, you've got Jesus in your boat. So when you're getting ready to go to the other side, be prepared for a storm. But number two, in order for you to get to where God is taking you, there will be some people you have to leave behind. Verse 36, leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. And that's really all I've got to say about that, because Jesus was going to the other side. Jesus was taking his disciples, and there were some other, as Pastor Tucker taught us, there were some other little boats that were going along with them. In order for you to get where God is taking you, there are going to be some people, there are going to be some friends who want to see you fail, but you've got to continue to go through because God is taking you to the other side. There are a select few people who are qualified to go with you. Only a select few people can really go through with you. It's just like when Jesus was in the garden and he took all of the disciples to the garden to pray, but then when he went on a little further and was really getting ready to get down and dirty in his prayers, he only took Peter, James, and John. He only took those three with him. The Bible says he went on a little further and he asked his closest disciples, those three were his brothers, they were his ride or die, but even they got tired. But Jesus still entrusted them enough to say, I want you all to come a little farther with me while I go pray. Not everybody can go to the other side with you. So you've got to be prepared for it. When you're going to the other side, be prepared for a storm. In order for you to get where God is going, remember that there are going to be some people you have to leave behind. And then number three, you've got to learn how to rest, even in the worst part of your storm. You've got to learn how to rest even when you know a storm is on the way. The disciples didn't necessarily know that this storm, because these were pop-up storms. These were scattered storms. These were storms that, yes, they knew they happened often, but it may be that there was a storm today and that there might not be a storm tomorrow. They didn't know exactly when the storm would hit. But we have hindsight, and we know spiritually that when we're going where God is taking us, we're going to run into some turbulence. We're going to run into some wind. We're going to run into some waves. We're going to run into some crazy coworkers. We're going to run into some bosses that get on our last nerve. We're going to run into some family members that sometimes we just want to disown them, but because we're blood, we got to stay with them anyway. There are going to be some people in our lives that are going to cause all kinds of storms, but what we've got to understand is we know it's coming, and when it comes, we've got the ability to rest again because we've got Jesus in the boat. Jesus knew this storm was coming. He knew that it wasn't going to be just an ordinary storm. He knew that it was going to be a storm like one that they may not have experienced before. But even though he knew the storm was coming, he also knew the outcome, and he also knew that the destination was the other side. Jesus knew he had an assignment. He knew he was going to the other side. He knew all of the disciples were going to the other side. So Jesus put his life in God's hands, and then he used this moment as a teaching moment to teach his disciples, look, you've got me. Remember, remember who I am. Remember that I am the Son of God. I'm the one that you believe that has come to save your very soul. So if you truly believe that, because later he says, have you still no faith? Because now they're marveling at the fact that Jesus is speaking to the wind. He's speaking to the waves. He's speaking to nature. He's speaking to the earth. He's speaking to the elements, and he's controlling them and telling them, peace, be still. So Jesus says, look, you've got me in your corner. You've got me on your boat. And regardless of whether I'm standing on the boat with you or regardless of whether I'm down below asleep, if I'm on the boat with you, you have nothing to worry about. So regardless of whether Jesus is asleep, regardless of whether Jesus is in a corner, wherever Jesus is, if he's on your boat, you don't have to worry. So be encouraged tonight that Jesus says we're going to the other side. And when Jesus says we're going to the other side, that means that no matter what comes or what goes, regardless of what goes on in between my western side and the eastern side of the sea, regardless of what I encounter, if Jesus says I'm going to the other side, it might take me longer to get there than I expected, but if he says I'm going, then I can rest in the fact that he said I'm going to the other side.